Hi, this is Doug Schneider. Welcome to Real Hi-Fi. In the previous episode, I talked about measurements, in particular, reviewers who actively disparage them. In this episode, I'm going to talk about measurements again, but flip completely to the other side and talk about reviewers and sometimes consumers who get so deep into the measurements, they forget one important thing: listening properly. When it comes to proper listening, I could talk about many things, but for this episode on measurements and listening, I want to zero in on the fundamental thing, the order in which you do things when you're reviewing. And I alluded to it in my previous episode when I talked about my review of the Paradigm Founder Series 100F loudspeaker. I said I had to do the listening before I got the measurements done, and that's the key. You have to listen first. That said, I'm going to throw a little bit of caveat in there. If the reviewer and the measurer aren't the same person, then it really doesn't matter the order in which they're done. The reviewer simply can't see the measurements first, and that's fine. But more and more today, particularly with YouTube reviewers, what's happening is the reviewer and the measurer are the same person. And then the order in which you do things becomes all the more important. Why I know this is vital is because I have firsthand experience with it here at SoundStage. Now, SoundStage is a very large operation, and for the most part, we have other writers doing the reviews. But I also do reviews, and I'm also in charge of the loudspeaker measurements. And I know firsthand from previous experience what has happened when I have seen measurements before I've actually listened to a speaker. They bias you, and they can lead you in a direction subjectively you might not otherwise go. With what I just said, I know that there are going to be some reviewers who puff up their chest, get all defensive and say, well, I can't be influenced like that. I would be able to listen even if I saw the measurements, to which I'll reply with one word: bullshit. I'll also add that there have been so many studies done for decades on how easy bias enters listening tests, and knowledge of what measurements look like, that can add a lot of bias. So now I'm going to get to the crux of what this is about. And it's a problem I see with some reviewers, and it's what consumers should be wary of. There are some reviewers who are so into the measurements that they're going to them first, and they're making evaluations, sonic judgments of what a product will sound like before they get into the listening test. And then when they go into the listening test, they say, aha, I heard just what I saw in the measurements. But did they really? Or did they bring those biases into the listening test and then they're hearing them? That's where it becomes really unclear and unreliable for the consumer. That's why ideally you do things the other way around. All the listening comes first or completely apart from the measurements, and the reviewer listens, I heard this, I heard this, I heard this, and then the measurements are looked at to say, do those measurements reflect what was heard? They are used to correlate what was heard, not dictate what was heard. So that's why you have to have the listening completely apart from the measuring. But in closing, I want to reinforce it with this story from Canada's National Research Council about something they used to do in their famous listening tests. What they used to do is ask the listeners to draw the frequency response charts of the various speakers they were listening to. So think about that for a second. Instead of seeing the measurement first and then listening next, they were actually asking to predict the measured response. I did it, and I did really well. But even then, no matter how adept a listener is, you always have to listen first, measure next.